Hello, I'm Stephen Colegrave, co-founder of Byline Times. Hopefully you've seen our daily website, bylinetimes.com, and our monthly paper, Byline Times. And it's a great privilege to be taking part in one of the sessions for London Climate Action Week, and even more of a privilege to be here with Tom Burke. I'm sure you know Tom, but he's chairman of E3G, Third Generation Environmentalism, which indeed is the host of London Action Week. Formerly director of Friends of the Earth, the Green Alliance, special advisor actually to 3 former ministers of the environment, and also previously formerly an advisor to Rio Tinto and BP. So a very long-standing environmentalist and someone who I'm very keen to actually have a conversation with now. But Tom, do you mind just sort of starting us off actually with a bit of an overview? I think we're really looking at the whole issue really of democracy and the environment and really how they interact.
It's really democracy and climate change, Stephen. And,
yes.
and in a sense, it starts from an observation that sort of pretty obvious when you think about it, which is that if we fail to deal with climate change, then the consequences will simply destroy the possibility of democracy, indeed possibly even civilization everywhere. On the other hand, if we are going to tackle successfully in the reasonably short period of time we have in order to deal with this problem, we won't be able to do that without democracy, without, in a sense, really functioning states that are able to mobilize their people and do things. So there's a real challenge because we win or we lose. This is a 1-0 deal. Either we can make democracy work for to deliver climate change, or if we fail to do that, we will lose democracy as part of that process. So that was the sort of starting point for this. And climate change is a really unique problem in human history. And I say unique, and I really mean unique. There is no precedent for a problem that really is an existential threat to civilization. And it's not an exaggeration, it's what the science has been telling us as loudly and often as it can now for almost 40-odd years. And we're still struggling to actually understand what that means. But it's unique because it affects every single person on the planet. The life chances for every single one of us will be determined by whether or not we succeed or fail. Now, there's never been a problem like that affected literally everybody on the planet. So the scale is different. So that means across all of the different cultures that we have, all of the different governance systems, somehow we've got to bring all of that together so that we're able to solve this problem. And what's more, we have to do it unlike any other challenge that humanity's faced. We have a timeline on this. It's not enough that we get there eventually. Human beings are good at learning by doing, making mistakes, learning from those mistakes, and then moving forward. If we don't, roughly speaking, solve this problem by around the middle of the century, i.e. get to net zero carbon emissions by the middle of the century, then it really will be increasingly difficult to solve. So we're not used to dealing with problems where there's a hard stop to the end point. It's a bit like diabetes in a funny sort of way. You know, diabetes is a disease that gets progressive and it's very much asymptomatic. You don't know you've got it, but it gets worse. The longer you fail to deal with it, the worse it gets. And eventually you go past a point when it doesn't matter what you do, you've gone too far and you can't recover back to sort of stability. So it's very, in a way, we've got a lot of people nowadays have got personal experience of the dynamics of climate change. And what's also very interesting about it, not perhaps totally unique in the other way, is that we actually understand this problem very well. We really know what the cause of this problem is. It's simply and basically burning fossil fuels. So in that sense, we know what we've got to do with it, deal with it. So now we know both the cause and the consequences. And we know that if we stop burning fossil fuels, then the problem will stop getting worse and will allow us to then, as it were, get back to, in a sense, a healthy planet, if you like. And we already have the means to do that. We have the technology now that is available now that would allow us to build an energy system, should we so wish, and put the effort and resources into it that did not depend on fossil fuels. And we're going to have a lot more technology as we go forward. And we're not going to make an instantaneous change. There's no kind of magic bullet that turns us over. But we also know it won't cost the Earth to do that. It will cost the Earth if we fail, or at least it'll cost civilization. It won't cost the Earth to do it. We spend about $1.2, $1.3 trillion a year on delivering fossil fuel energy. It will cost about the same to deliver renewable energy. So it's not that we can't afford to do it. However, it's a massive change. And as with any change, there'll be winners and losers. Some people will benefit from the change, and by and large, they'll be very happy to go on and enjoy, as it were, their benefits. The losers, however, if we don't actually be very careful about it, will get very, very resistant and will form really strong opposition to making that sort of change. Now, politics is the process by which we choose who wins and who loses, or what we do about the losers. So politics is central. We really don't have a problem with technology. We have lots of problems, but not a core strategic problem, nor do we have a problem with economics. Again, we have a bit of a problem with economists who quite often come up with the wrong solutions, but we don't really have a problem with the economics. But we really do have a problem, and I think we're under-researched, we're not paying enough attention to it, with the politics of climate change. That is, with bringing together the coalitions of people and interests that we need in order to make this unprecedented change in terms of its scale. And in a sense, what we've learned from the various tech revolutions we are still going through is you can't have a technology revolution without a social revolution. And an awful lot of our attention is focused on how to make the technology revolution work. We're not really focusing on how do you cope with the social consequences of that. So how do you make sure that the people who've really worked hard to make sure we have fossil fuels available for us to meet our energy needs don't get left behind as we shift out of fossil fuels into the cleaner, greener, a safer economy that's there for the asking. And that's really where politics becomes central to it, because we're not going to make that kind of massive change without government playing a central role. But in particular, if we want to make a social revolution work to accompany the technology revolution, governments are going to have to do an awful lot of that work. You can see how the marketplace will do a lot of the work, the capital markets will do a lot of the work of making the energy transition, but it won't be up to the markets and carbon prices and those sort of things to make the social transition. That will require a lot more from government than I think any of us have ever really been used to. And that's why democracy is so important. There are really two bits to government. There's an administrative bit of government and there's a political bit of government. Now, by and large, at least in the OECD countries, the administrative bit of government works fairly well, but the political bit of government really does not work very well and is working increasingly badly. And the kind of things we're seeing in Britain at the moment are a good example of the political bit kind of letting us all down. And so it's really important. The way you change the political bit is through democracy. That's the tool you have to change the political bit. And so, I mean, very good arguments about why democracy is right anyway. And as Winston Churchill famously said, it's the worst form of government, bar all the others. But there are two particular things that I want to pick out as reasons why democracy matters as we come to dealing with climate change. And the first of those reasons is that in order to hold on to power, despots have to destroy all the machinery humanity has ever learned to build the hard way in order to learn from our mistakes. So a free press, an independent judiciary, a professional civil service and public services, stable public finances, all of these mechanisms get destroyed by despots in order to hold on to power. And there is no mistake-free way to make the changes that we've got to make, given the scale and complexity of them. We're going to make mistakes. So we have to retain that ability to learn rapidly from the mistakes. And I think in particular, we need we're going to make mistakes in the social revolution in terms of making sure that we don't leave people behind as we make the change. And the second reason is this can't be done by governments or indeed by markets or business alone. We've really got to mobilize a whole of society approach to dealing with this problem. And if governments are not seen as legitimate, and if you like, what democracy does is legitimize the use of state power, then if governments are not seen as legitimate or felt to be legitimate by people, it's very hard to mobilize them to play their part. And literally, this is going to be, people are going to have to play their part down to the smallest villages in the world, through the cities, the towns and cities, regions and states. People are going to have to join in, and they won't join in if government is felt to be legitimate, because what you really need when you want to mobilize large numbers of people to change is people need to trust you. And in that sense, if the government is not felt to be legitimate, that trust that's necessary to get people to move, to join in, is missing. Now, we saw how powerful that could be, for instance, with COVID, when we constantly found the government was trying to say, slow down in making change, and the public had got the message, and we're trying to drive the government to do more and be more aggressive. So there isn't something wrong with the people. If they trust, if there's trust there and they're well led, people will do what the best they can to make a difference. And I don't think we can solve climate change without the people joining in and doing the best they can. And that's why I think democracy is not just a nice to have, but absolutely central to solving the problem of climate change. And by the same token, if we don't solve the problem of climate change, we won't have very much democracy left. So that's really what the point of that I've been trying to make.
No, I completely agree with you. I think, though, there are some worries because obviously, as you say, it's a whole system change. It's a huge change. And we also have some big parts of the world that don't have democracy.
Yeah.
Like China, obviously, is a very important partner to this.
Yeah.
And, and you have Bolsonaro, in the Amazon, in some key places in the world, really, for this fight against climate change. We don't really have democracy in place.
That's right.
As such. I think what's more worrying too is just generally politicians, because what you're talking about are people that can lead people, because you've got to lead people to somewhere which is perhaps a bit scary, a bit unknown. So that sort of trust and leadership, I feel you're absolutely right. You've got to have democracy as a building block, but you need a particular type of politician.
Yeah. Democracy isn't enough on its own. And I'm really talking about not so much about the forms of democracy as the reality of democracy as a sense in which there is a legitimization of the use of state power. Because, as I said, without the use of state power, we're not going to be able to mobilize the resources and focus them on dealing with the problem. So you're right. And you're absolutely right that we're a long way from having democracy everywhere. In fact, the various people who run indices of this thing have tracked over the last few years how the number of countries in which there is democracy or a move towards democracy is declining, not increasing. But unless you identify the problem, then you're not going to address it at all. So my first step is to identify the problem. And also, I'm not looking for the perfect to be the enemy of the better than we've got. So I'm looking for the best approximation we can get to democracy. So, there's an awful lot of the sort of forms of democracy. I'm not really preaching about them. But if you think about Britain ourselves, we've been kind of reversing into democracy for 1,500 years, and we've not got there. But we have a very democratic culture, which supports the fact that compared to the United States, or indeed most of our European countries, we don't have a very democratic constitution. Indeed, we don't really have a constitution that's written down. So what I'm really looking for is for people to press in to get the best approximation they can to democracy. And what's central to that actually is that people do when they have the opportunity, and that actually is still there in an awful lot of countries, they vote. So for instance, Bolsonaro will be coming up for a re-election again fairly soon. Really important that for the climate and for all of us, that Brazilians at least vote, because Lula will be running against him. There's a chance. It really alarms me that young people in this country, for instance, don't vote anything like as much as old people.
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah.
Because there does seem to me, we've said no democracy is perfect, but I think it's really important that our younger generation values democracy. I mean, it was quite interesting, I think, over the EU referendum, that actually a lot of younger people didn't realise till after the election that they were losing something.
That's exactly right. They've lost quite a lot. Lost travel rights, lost rights to go to universities, lost an awful lot. And they didn't vote. And it was very clear that a majority of people under 35 wanted to vote to stay in, but they were, I've forgotten the percentage now, but they were really lower part of the age cohorts turning out. Look, for young people, this is the best chance you have to make a difference to the future, is to vote for people who support what you're doing, a really much more aggressive action on climate change. I don't care what party they come from. Left and right have both got problems with dealing with climate change. So I'm not making a partisan point, but it's really important. If you're under 35 and you want to have a future, anything like as good as the one you and I have had, then you really do need to vote. That's the first piece. And to defend your right to vote and to oppose people who try to take away your right to vote. And there are people, not everywhere, not just in America, which is a bit famous, but also in this country where you now got people saying there should be voter ID before you can vote, knowing that that would defer quite a lot of people from voting. So that's really important, that piece of voting. But then joining in, not just voting. Voting is once every now and then. There are lots of other ways to join in the democratic processes, and that should be done. But you made another important point earlier, Stephen, which is about it's not just democracy and democratic opportunities, it's leadership. And leadership enormously is important. And leadership isn't about telling people what they've got to do. Leadership is about giving people a reason to do what they want to do. And that's, I think, been one of the areas where politicians have failed enormously at the moment. They're giving people lots of sort of suites of policies they think people will feel attractive, but they're not really giving people a narrative about why it's important for them to vote and why it's important for them to support more aggressive action on climate change.
I mean, we would also say there are vested interests or lobby groups that are funding some of these politicians and parties.
Yeah.
Which, and I think that's back to the whole system change, really, isn't it? That, there's this sort of, I think political parties have got to find a way to be funded, not by those interests.
Well, I think there certainly needs to be very much more control over the funding of political parties. I mean, you have the weird situation in the United States where the Supreme Court found that corporate entities had legal rights, which was a bizarre idea, but legal rights to vote, if you see what I mean, to free speech, which was a totally bizarre idea. I can see why legal entities have rights that, as they incorporate, come with those rights. But the idea that you have a voice as a legal entity seems to me really bizarre. You have the whole sort of idea, which has come very prevalent here, about the extent to which there's Russian money that's become a very important part of influx of money into political parties in Britain. So I really do think you're absolutely right to pick up on a point about how political parties are funded. And it's really important.
And it's not just, fossil fuel interests or Russians. I mean, there are hedge funds, all sorts of, that make money out of things that aren't necessarily good for climate change. So
anybody who's got a entrenched or a vested interest, and you don't want to stop people, in a sense, being able to influence what political parties do. It's absolutely right in democracy that they should. What you really want to stop is secret or covert funding. Now, we have laws that are supposed to prevent that, but they're not properly enforced. They're not very rigorous. There are lots of loopholes.
Keeps us very busy in terms of investigations. But,
exactly.
But I'd like to go back to this point about the fact that the public are ahead of politicians often, and really somehow politicians got to leapfrog over them in a way and help them move forward. But at the moment, they seem to be a drag on the public, really.
I think that's exactly right. And I think what's happened in the last few years, the politicians haven't really cottoned on to yet. And what's really happened is that the science has been validated in the public mind by experience. And so people are busy, they've got lots of things to think about, they're not paying a lot of attention to what comes out in the science, and they're always a bit unsure they've remembered it correctly. Most people, not quite clear about what it means and means for their life. But what's been happening, and we've seen really particularly in the last 3 or 4 years, is people's experience has been of extreme weather events, of storms, of floods, of droughts. All of these things have really validated the conversation that they've been following, as it were, in the media, and really confirmed in the public mind that we have a problem with climate change. That's particularly true, I think, for younger people, that they've really now people, when they've experienced something, are really confident.
No, I had a meeting this morning with somebody who's from Bangladesh, and all they wanted to talk was about flooding and climate change. So I think then it becomes very visceral and real. I mean, I think there is a problem, though, that actually a lot of what I would call establishment figures in the West and Europe aren't really personally experiencing climate change like people perhaps in Africa or Pakistan or Bangladesh or other areas are.
I certainly think that's true, and those countries are less able to cope with it. We're having that. It's not that there are effects over there that aren't happening here. The effects are happening here too, but we're just much better able to cope with them, so they haven't gone up the political agenda. So I think you're right that, in a sense, there's still a tendency amongst the political class to think that's a problem for over there or out there in the future, rather than a problem right now. But there's an important thing about people's experience. They really have confidence that what has happened to them has happened. And that's a very solid sort of basis. And I think that's what the politicians are not yet picking up and responding to, that the public really understand.
I think people notice things like seasons changing, things like that.
Exactly.
There are things that, just as a person, you just think, something's really out of kilter now. This is really important.
And that's exactly right. And that's why I again go back to democracy, because I don't think there's anything wrong with the people. I think the people have got it. And as you said, I think they're up for doing it, provided they're given good and clear leadership, that their expectations are shaped. I think the politicians are still in a position where they think that politics can beat physics, and it can't. Climate change is about physics. It's not about people's opinions. It's not about what people think should or shouldn't happen. It's about what is the physics of carbon in the atmosphere and how that translates into the experiences that people are having. And in a sense, the public is getting that and not trying to fight against the physics, while I think the politicians are still thinking they can negotiate with the physics. Well, I've got news for them. Carbon atoms don't negotiate.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to talk about the global nature of this, because I think, as you said, nobody can hide from this. It actually affects us all. If you think about the big Western democracies, though, that set up that sort of post-war international system of the UN and these other global institutions, how do you feel about those? Do you feel confident they're going to be part of this, or do you think it's going to be almost to spite them, that everything's going to sort of build?
No, and I think it goes back to why I think this is a unique problem. I don't feel confident about that. And this is part of this is human beings learn by their mistakes. So the mistakes of the first half of the 20th century, where in effect we had an extended war with a break in the middle, really did, and then the atom bomb went off, really did lead the people who were in running governments, the politicians in charge, really understood there were consequences to failure. So they built a set of institutions that were designed to prevent failure. Again, prevent us going back, and as they said, never again. And, that memory is fading. The memory, and we don't have politicians who really understand that there are consequences to failure in quite the way that the people who'd actually had to navigate their way through the whole of the first half of the 20th century into the second half. So we've begun to underinvest and lose confidence in the ability of those institutions to provide a sort of stable framework at a global level in which we can deal with all the sort of different problems and indeed the common problems that are arising. There isn't any way, in a sense, that you can deal with climate change without pooling sovereignty. But you have to share. So I don't mean you have to give up nationality. You can retain every single characteristic of nationality you want, but you really do have to pool sovereignty, because nobody can solve this problem on their own. There is no hard power, no military solution to climate policy failing. If it fails for all of us. So that piece about the need to restore confidence in that global rules system, renew it, revitalize it, by all means, reinvest in it without doubt, but understand that you can't solve this problem without pooling sovereignty. Now, Britain, I mean, people have all kinds of reasons why they did or didn't support Brexit. But one of the things that the EU is the world's most successful and sustained experiment in the pooling of sovereignty. And it seemed to me kind of rather foolish for Britain to pull itself out of that experiment for what looked increasingly like trivial and rather unreliable reasons, because that pooling of sovereignty. And again, you can only do that if you have the trust and confidence of your population, which again is why democracy is so important.
I think Mr. Macron's offered us Europe 2.0, but I think Mr. Johnson has actually not gone for that, but it was nearly.
Well,
Tom, I wonder if I could ask you quite a personal question now. Yeah. I understand you were sort of on the board of Friends of the Earth, 28, was it? 27?
I was chief director, as executive director.
Executive director at 28. So, yeah. So you've been in this game quite a long time, really. Yeah. I won't say, I'll spare your blushes and say how many years, but I just wonder what you've seen. I mean, obviously there's been a big change in terms of the immediacy and the emergency of what we're talking about. But have you seen a parallel change in terms of people really understanding this, people wanting to do things, of things happening, of commitments by people? Or do you still feel that people haven't really woken up yet?
I don't think there's anything wrong with the people. I think people everywhere, and not just in the democracies, people all over the world get it, and they want to do something about it. And when they can, they do something about it. And we've seen that in all kinds. I mean, we could spend the next several hours going through all of the kind of different things at different levels, from the very smallest localist level to the largest, as it were, geopolitical level, where people, when they can, have made an effort to do something. But that's not all pulled together. If you like, one of the things I've thought about is, this is like a giant opera. Climate change, dealing with climate change like a gigantic opera, which has enormous number of players on the stage. They've all got parts, but nobody's written a libretto. And that's, in a sense, what leadership does. So we don't really have good global leadership that can write that libretto, sort of give everybody a sense of where their place is. But my confidence in the people is not just because I've seen lots of the things that people have done, but it's also, when you look wider, you look at the fact that in Britain, people who've probably not had a pay rise for 15 years, every time there's sports aid or children in need or Red Nose Day, they cough up 30 million, pretty reliably, 30 million out of those already strained pockets. So it tells me there's nothing wrong with the people. And as I said earlier, when you look at how people in this country and indeed around the world responded to COVID, and how the reaction from the public was to pull together and share, I don't think there's anything wrong with the people. So I think one of the reasons for wanting to raise this issue is to then focus on, well, how can you take advantage of that? How can you turn that into something that really makes a difference? And that's by focusing on this question of democracy, participating in democracy, fighting to protect it because it is under attack. But that's, and it's my act of faith, in a way, that there's nothing wrong with the people that keeps me doing it. Because there are times when it's been pretty gloomy, like now, in the way, in the middle of a war, a huge recession coming on, cost of living crisis, you can get pretty gloomy. And if I didn't have that underlying confidence in the common decency of people everywhere, not just in Britain, really throughout the world, then what would be the point of going on making all the effort? And I do have that faith in the people. So if they're not doing what's right, what am I doing, or what are we doing that's not really tapping into that basic common decency? And that, for me, is the core challenge. Democratic countries allow you to do that better than non-democratic countries as well. One of the things that you see in China, as you pointed out, China's destroying any sort of civil society, that capacity for people to organize themselves to do things in order to hold on to power. That's why despots are so bad. Here we have this fantastic response of people to join organizations and join in with something. It's enormous.
I think on the flip side too, supporting what you're saying, a lot of those sort of far-right entities that have been anti-vax and other types of fake news, they're the same people that are against climate change. So you begin to realize it's the undemocratic elements that are actually against what we're talking about.
If you have a problem, that requires you to give up your core political project around which you've built your identity, you can't have the problem. So you have to deny that it exists. Yeah. If your core political project is smaller, possibly no government, lighter taxation or no taxation, lighter regulations or no regulations, never expanding freedom of choice for individuals, you've probably got a bit of a problem with climate change. So you better work out how to stop it being there.
Absolutely. And you see states that where democracy becomes in danger, you find civil institutions get attacked as well, which is very much the rule of law, the independent civil service, all things that we know are going to be incredibly important in terms of fighting climate change. Well, look, we've had about half an hour. We'll keep talking. But it might be some people want to ask us some questions. So I think at this point, if anyone wants to ask a question, please do. If we get no questions, well, we'll just keep chatting.
We won't have a problem carrying on.
We'd love you to join in if you could, really. So George is going to type up any questions that arrive, and we can sort of keep chatting. Are you all right?
No, I just got a little crap. I moved my leg and I got a little.
You can have a little run around if you like. Run around the table would be fine, really. So XR, Extinction Rebellion, always said if you had 3.5% of the population, rising up and really voting and putting pressure on for fighting climate change, you would be able to sort of overturn governments or get governments to really change their focus. Are you sort of a believer in that type of thing?
No, I don't. I think that was probably some pretty shaky analysis. And certainly applied to this problem. I think there's well more than 3% of people in this country want to get something done about the problem and are willing to take action to do so. So having said I don't agree with that sort of analysis or change model, I think change is more complicated than that. And bringing about change in society, change across nations and cultures is much more complicated than that kind of piece of analysis would do. But I think that challenge and provocation is a perfectly legitimate tactic to raise awareness, to draw attention to the scale and the spread of popularity of an issue. I think that's a long established tradition in Britain in particular. So I think Extinction Rebellion were in a way reflecting exactly that level of public support for action on climate change. They were an expression of it. They weren't the vehicle for changing it. They were a manifestation of just how far people in Britain wanted to say. And you saw that in the classic kind of piece that came, there's incidents in our history where when you had very, very tough laws against sheep stealing, when juries wouldn't find somebody guilty because the penalty for being found guilty was you got hung. And you found a couple of examples during the recent Extinction Rebellion where juries simply refused to convict somebody of things because they quite correctly felt that they, as it were, the law was in error at this point. And those boundaries are partly how you move democracies forward. You explore the boundaries. And I think it was quite right that when people really did things that threatened or put other people at risk, that you had much more vigorous reaction from the authorities. But exploring that, Gray, I spent a large part of my life as an environmentalist, and certainly exploring those boundaries was part of what we were doing back in the 70s and 80s when we were struggling to raise any kind of awareness about the broader environmental questions. So I do understand and understand exactly why Extinction Rebellion, not only why the people did that, but also why it got such a broadly positive response from the public, though government didn't like it very much. But governments of any kind, even democratic governments.
A few newspapers didn't like it either, I seem to remember.
Yeah, but some of those newspapers, I'm quite hard to distinguish between the government and them. Well, at least the political part of the government.
Very astute observation, I think, really. Very astute observation, especially when you've had a prime minister who's actually been a journalist writing for one of those publications. But that's not really we're not too much our subject for today. But I wondered, is there a democracy or a country, a democracy that for you is going a little bit further, faster than other democracies, do you think, down this route?
It's hard to in a sense, run an index in that way because countries are very different. So a country like Britain, whatever the fifth or sixth largest GDP, has different set of problems in making a transition from a country like, say, Denmark or Sweden, much smaller scale, much more coherent. They're more democratic countries and they've clearly gone further. But I'm not sure what that's telling you, really, because of that difference. America has this phenomenally democratic constitution and, really powerful democratic institutions, but somehow it hasn't been able to go as far as it could. So I think that kind of, you can oversimplify that kind of index. There isn't a league table. What really matters is that countries change, get out of fossil fuels, and they should be doing it to preserve their own security, their own national security. They should be doing it in order to preserve the ability of their people to be secure and prosperous. So in a sense, how much democracy matters. It's more back on the point that you made earlier about the importance of leadership as well as the sort of institutional or political arrangements, as it were. Are you getting the right leadership that's appropriate to where you are?
Yes, I wonder whether there's a new generation of leadership that's going to come to the fore, really. But I want to go back to about the civil institutions, about the thing about democracy is it's a stable form of government, isn't it? So it tends to have civil society, civil institutions. I was thinking very much of Client Earth, for instance, where you can actually go and take a judicial route in terms of I think even in China, Client Earth has had some success, hasn't it, really, I think?
The reality of democracy is you have checks and balances. And so, and overall, you have the rule of law. And the rule of law is kind of an interesting question in lots of ways, because you can't have democracy without the rule of law. And we saw in the United States in January of this year how fragile the rule of law can be, even in a very strongly institutionalized democracy like the United States. And you can't really have the rule of law without social cohesion. If people don't believe that the law will work for them and will be fair, then there's no reason to support it, and therefore you can't really have democracy without the rule of law. So there's a sort of triangle, in a sense, in every country that underpins the ability to deal with climate change, which is the triangle between social cohesion, the rule of law, and democracy. And you have to build and maintain that. So some of the threats, actually, to democracy can come in very ways you're not looking for. And one of the things I'm very conscious of is the extent to which we're underfunding the legal system in this country. So you have lawyers on strike today because their income has fallen 28% in real terms. You have courts held up because the government's closed down courts. You have a whole series of sort of institutional arrangements, failures that are weakening people's confidence in the law. You have rape victims who can't get into court. You have criminals spending 2 or 3 years on remand. All of these sort of failures undermine the rule of law. And if you're undermining the rule of law, you're undermining democracy. If you can't challenge legally, protest legally, then you're undermining democracy for all those reasons you say.
We've got a question actually coming up, which is great. We've got, I think it's Michael, I can't quite see it. Let me put my glasses on. Right, jolly good. Right, Michael Lamotti, postgraduate researcher in anti-blackness in climate policy, says nothing has changed under our political democratic system in the West. Therefore, people like Andreas Malm and others, including indigenous people around the world, are talking about literally smashing pipelines. Increasingly, it appears to be the only option for change, a stepping up protest towards revolution. What part of democracy gives us hope we won't need to take the revolutionary route? So, interesting, isn't it? I mean, it comes a little bit back to the XR question we had, which is that have we got time, I suppose, for democracy to work? Is democracy a very slow way of working? Do we have to do something? We're talking about climate emergency. Do we have to take, things in our own hands and be much more sort of action orientated about this?
I understand Michael's impatience. Let me tell you, I'm a 60s kid. I mean, I've been there on the need for change and revolution. But you have to say, what's your change model? So how does your action bring about change? And one of the things that I'm very conscious of is that if you challenge power, you better be sure you've got more power or you lose. So I'm all for, as I said about extinction, I'm all for the piece of provocation.
Which democracy should allow.
Democracy should allow.
Yes.
But when you're starting to challenge power, especially when you're starting to challenge power that's been legitimized by democracy, you will lose. That's a lesson, if you like, from 50 years of environmental campaigning. You will lose. You will not win that way. I'm concerned about winning. I want to win. I didn't agree with Michael's premise. I understand his frustration, but lots of things have changed. We do a lot of things better now than we did when I was first running Friends of the Earth. We're not doing anything as much as we should be doing and change, whether it's actually on the environment or indeed in a number of other issues. Some issues have changed in ways I would never have believed. We now have same-sex marriage. I can promise you, 30 years ago, you would have thought that was a dream beyond anybody's ability to deliver. Yet it happened here. So I don't think it's right to say nothing changes and nothing changes in democracy. I think that's wrong. Do the things you want to change as fast as you want them, not very often. That means you need to get engaged and make sure you elect the right politicians, make sure you engage yourself in the political process. But I don't think we're going to solve this problem by delegitimizing the use of power. What works in different countries, it depends. There are countries where it may be right, as Michael was saying towards the end, where you have no ability. China might, for instance, in some people's estimation, be one, where the only option you have is to, as it were, try to rebel against it. You've got to be pretty damn brave if you think you're going to rebel in China. And I have enormous admiration for people who are that brave. But the lessons from examples around the world of people trying to do that against state power are not good markers for success. So again, understanding that people in their situation, there are places where that would, to my mind, be exactly the right thing to do in terms of moral and courage, personal courage and conviction. Whether I think that would change very much, I think that's more open.
It's interesting. I was thinking about those countries, the COP, the countries which were actually facing the problems of climate change now, in a very, very real way. And obviously they're hoping to get money from the West, but in a sense, you could see them putting huge pressure on other nations because of what they're facing.
Yeah, I don't think they could use Michael's.
No, not Michael's theory, but they could be slightly more radical potentially, I suppose.
But you are in a battle of power. What power do they have to get the G20 countries, which are responsible for about 80% of carbon emissions? What power do they have to do that? If you can't negotiate a solution, you can't, as it were, arrive at a common problem, a way of addressing the problem, then it's about negotiating your power against their power. And by definition, the countries that are most vulnerable, suffering most from the problem we've caused, have very little power in that situation. The danger for us is, in a way, that we don't understand how much in our interest it is to solve that problem. So we look at, what did we do this year? The Prime Minister went to the G7 meeting in Cornwall at the start of that COP26 year and announced he was going to cut our aid budget. And there were loud claps from, certainly from some of the newspapers in this country, as if that was a smart move. Well, if we don't help those people make their countries work, then you will need more than Rwanda to deal with the tides of immigrants that will be coming. And
also they might take money off China for the Belt Road, which is probably going to be a lot less environmentally sustainable.
Well, and I see, interestingly, that the G7 have just announced, in a sense, they're going to compete a bit more aggressively to provide money for infrastructure and in a sense, climate compatible infrastructure to compete a bit with the Belt and Road Initiative. So I think that's quite good. But I think you've got to see, the reason I said about the pooling of sovereignty earlier on, and the reason why I think that was so important is, as I said, there is no escape from climate policy failure. Nobody escapes. It might come at you in all kinds of ways you didn't expect, but you will pay a price if you fail. So thinking about giving overseas aid, it's investing in making sure that we sharing our sovereignty and that we together have a more secure future. So that's the point about then political ideas. And what scares me a lot about our sort of current political discourse is you end up with these sort of floating suites of policy initiatives that politicians think will appeal to one audience or another audience. And you don't talk about the key sort of political ideas. Freedom. Climate policy failure will take away freedom from everybody for all kinds of things. So you now have a battle between what's more important, our freedom to burn all the fossil fuels we want, or our freedom to have a freedom from a climate we can't live with. Now, I want to hear that kind of conversation going on, because that's setting out kind of core political principles, which I think people grasp a bit more easily than they grasp complex policy prescriptions about how relevant to life is. My guess is most people would say it's much more important that we're free from a climate we can't live with than we're free to burn our fossil fuels. You have a very clear signal from the public on that, then governments are freed up to take more aggressive, more sustained action to deal with the problem.
Yes, it seems to me that information is really important on this, though. And you know, actually, I suppose I would say that being, you know, in the news business, as it were, but I mean, making sure that people are properly informed. Because what worries me is people are often seeing the symptoms of what's going on, particularly governments. So you take the refugee crisis, or whatever you want to call it, you know, 30% of refugees leaving countries around the world are probably due to climate change already. But I don't feel really that the government has any perception of that, or even people, you know, in here have an idea of that, really.
Well, I think what I'm hearing you driving towards is we have a very impoverished public discourse. And I think that if that's where you were kind of going, I think you're right about that. And I think some of that is technological and some of that's political. The technology bit is the growth of social media, the growth of the whole sort of all of the technology around that, which has tended to privatize experience. And people live increasingly in bubbles of their own choosing. And that means there is no public space to have public conversations. And I think that's a really big weakness when you're trying to mobilize people to act together. And that puts a sort of, in a way, that puts a different burden on the current print and broadcast media, because in the 20th century, without the internet, it was an enormous task to inform people. By and large now, with Google, everybody informs themselves. You talk to, you're having a conversation with a 22-year-old and you say something they don't know about, and they're immediately looking it up. So I think the role of the media is shifting in a way in which they haven't fully understood, and in which we are not really thinking about politically. And it shifted from being sources of information to being sources of meaning, to being a source of meaning, to the explanatory, that wreath thing, to inform and to explain bit. And I think, and by explain, I mean something different from opinion. And I think
perhaps connecting some of these dots as well.
Well, that's exactly my point. Connecting some of these dots. That mission to explain more. Now, how do you square that with a whole battle over attention? And I understand
and news cycles. So
yeah, exactly. Yes. So there's a whole. I mean, I'm trying to set out the challenge. I don't have a remedy for it, but I think there's an important piece for the media now, both print and broadcast media, to see their role less about informing of things, at least in relation to a problem like climate change, and more about the interpretation, the meaning, and building trust and confidence around the meaning of that for people's lives, that it is about that straight information piece. And that does mean sort of more editorial judgment, more care editorially, and it does mean sorting out the opinion piece and being really clear about the boundary between opinion and explanation.
And perhaps allowing a bit of physics to get into the media, as it were, really. But I would like to circle back a little bit to this younger generation, because you know, all the polling we've done shows that climate change is right at the top of their concern. But somehow we're not reflecting that in society. We're not, these people, as you say, young people aren't voting enough. They haven't got enough voice in the media. They don't, their voice doesn't seem to be being heard and having any purchase of what's going on. I wonder what we could do about that, why that is, and is there anything we could do to help that, other than, you know, a generation dies off and a new generation comes. But
I think
it's too long.
I think it's a moving on from what I experienced when I was that sort of age, when I joined the local Friends of the Earth group, and the idea was you just wanted to raise awareness and you wanted to draw attention to something. And I think, in a sense, we've gone past that point. So I think there's a much, and the organizations, like all those civil society organizations, the really important thing is to get people to do something, rather than to get people to say something, to get people involved in doing, to give them some agency, even if it's very local and immediate. Because I think what's awful about when you talk to young people, and I talk to young people and see that sort of sense of gloom as they look at the future and how that doom, no real sense of agency. And when I was a 60s kid, it never occurred to me you couldn't solve the problem. It took me a long time to learn. It was a lot more difficult than I thought then. But you started from that sense the problem was solvable. You just had to talk about it a lot. I think now it's much more about doing and being able to do, which is partly why you see this massive influx of people into all kinds of different environmental jobs. Wanting to work, whether not just in environmental NGOs, I mean, in all through the different institutions, particularly in the city. There are now something like 10, 12,000 environmental green professionals in the city of London, which is like mind-blowing.
No, I think there was some research the other day that showed that actually if you invest in green industries, actually it's a far better profit return. So it does work within our existing system in a way.
Well, and partly that's them responding to the upward pressure from the recruits, because they need the best and brightest to work, and the best and brightest bring their predilections with them. But I think the civil society organizations, the NGOs, need to do a much better job of getting people to do things rather than simply to, click to this, sign petitions and go on demos. Because I think we've gone beyond that, the point where unless they're like Extinction Rebellion or something like Greta, they're really making a difference. And, it's one thing to get that headlines right, but actually dealing with this problem is a much more sustained effort than just getting the right headlines.
It seems to work very well when it's a single issue, like, not having plastics or eating plant-based food. I think to me, that's a good sign. It shows that generation is very keen to actually do things and actually change the way they live. It's just how do we help them go to the next step, as it were, really?
But exactly, vote and do, so change your lifestyle, and that's brilliant. I mean, we've seen a lot of that from the markets. What you get is an echo back from the people doing market research about what people want. Then you start to create that feedback mechanism that encourages the kind of change, which we've seen enormously in things like diet, things like that. Again, in ways I wouldn't really have expected to happen so quickly, but this is a bit more than about individual choice. Dealing with this problem is a collective decision-making problem. It's not an individual decision-making problem only. We've got to work together. So pooling of sovereignty at a global level is the kind of overarching.
I think that's the issue. It's persuading people that it's not just what you do individually. Yeah. It's actually voting. It's actually putting pressure on. It's actually talking about things that are going to make a democratic change that then going to mean there's going to be a system change.
Yes.
And that's a difficult thing to talk about, because you're talking about something that's very personal and quite small to something that seems very big and amorphous, really.
Well, and it would help if you had leaders that were posing the choices that people could grasp. I mean, look, we need to innovate a lot in order to get through this problem in all kinds of. I don't just mean technology innovation.
Yes.
But if we're going to innovate, if you're going to take this, you need competition. Competition is what drives innovation. But if competition exceeds a sort of limit, an envelope of cooperation, then it becomes chaos, which is what we saw with financial competition in the financial sector with the financial crash. Absolutely. It just becomes chaotic. So you have to have innovation. So you have to have a discussion about how do you get competition and cooperation to work together.
I think Alex here has got a very good question, actually. Alex Green at Ashton. What do you think of the role of schools and education in changing society?
I think it's a central role. It's a central role. They're not, as long as they're not campaigning. institutions.
But it is a leadership role as well.
Yes,
education,
but leadership gets you to do what you want to do, to reflect your interests and to act on your interests. Management gets you to do something that needs to be done. So there's an interesting boundary that you can cross.
Yes.
And I think people would be very alarmed if they thought we were trying to turn our schools into places that we're going to be campaigning institutions on climate change.
No, I suppose it's a bit like us in newspapers, news, because what we're saying is, we have to provide people with the insight,
Yes.
the information,
Yes.
and the investigations,
Yes.
that then give them the tools to go and do things. It's the same with education; it gives you the tools to then go and do something after.
And that's the central role that Alex is asking about: is the provision of the tools. We really, in a way that was unimaginable to me when I was at school, we really have information on tap. But if you don't have the tools to use that information to evaluate fact, truth from falsehood, those sort of tools, and that's what I was really trying to steer towards, not turning schools into propaganda machines on climate change, but that really using climate change to allow people, to equip people with the tools is really powerful.
And also looking at it across different subjects.
Of course.
Because, you don't have to be that propagandist. If you just look at the physics, you see what the issue is, don't you, really?
Well, you do, but you can't solve it if you don't look at the then full spectrum. You need to do history, for instance. I mean, one of the things that most informs my sense of what we need to do is how much I've learned from history. You need to do economics. So you can't locate this. That's why it requires a whole of society response, because you can't deal with it in the pillars. And that's a particular piece, again, about schools, which are not about, as it were, teaching. They're about equipping people with tools to understand. They're not about giving people doctrine to sign up to. And I think that's really the important point I wanted to make on schools. And
we've got about
by and large, they've been
4 minutes left now. So if anyone else has a question, it'd be good for them to give us now. But it might be worth us I'd probably sort of a bit of a summing up question, as it were. So if you were Prime Minister of this country now, arise, Sir Tom, I wonder what you would be doing. How would you be leading this country now in terms of what we're talking about? What would you be doing differently, as it were?
Well, first of all, telling the story about how this is an enormous opportunity for the people of Britain to do something that's good for themselves and good for the planet. And what's more, the thing they need to do most immediately, which I will be wanting government to support properly, is to get their bills down by saving energy, by cutting down that is the single most important thing that people can do. And it gets everybody a chance to join in tackling this giant problem in their own homes right away, and doing something that's good for their lives immediately, as well as good for their kids and good for the planet.
Quite a big contribution, about 15%, isn't it? I think, of carbon.
Yeah, something
in this
like
country
that.
From a heating.
But it's also the quickest, fastest way to get emissions down, and the fastest way to get bills down. And that's the bit that gives you, in a sense, the truth in the government. Because why on earth was that not the dominant bit of the Chancellor's spring budget statement? Now, one of the reasons for that is if you cut energy use down, you don't need to build a lot of nuclear power stations. So the government seems to have some huge thing about building lots of nuclear power stations, which is a response to lobbies, not to analysis, in my view. But it's that sort of thing that right away, because you've got to connect it to people's lives. You've got to have a narrative that connects,
and I suppose,
to people's lives.
Industry as well could do that. Industry could become much more efficient, couldn't it?
Well, industry could become much more efficient, but also if you're going to do that, the second thing is, what would you have to do in order to do? You'd enormously have to level up, because they would be jobs distributed throughout the country. We have some staggering number, about 10 million homes that are under-insulated. They're scattered all over there, and predominantly the worst are in the north of the country. And we really do, in order to maintain social cohesion, which, as I said earlier, is a central part of that.
That'd be a proper levelling up policy, wouldn't it?
Yeah,
rather than a rhetoric one.
That's
that'd
what
be
I mean.
The real thing.
It would be the real thing.
Yeah.
You're doing something, you're putting money in to doing that. And my sense is, you've asked for one thing. I mean, if I was Prime Minister, I'd probably have a much bigger agenda.
Of course.
But that's one thing which gives you a kind of marker for the kind of things that I would be looking for a government that was really leading on this. There is another simple thing. the cheapest way to provide electricity for people is through onshore wind farms. The only reason that we don't have more onshore wind farms is because the government stops us having them. So there are things you could take away as well as opportunities you could create that would allow people to join in. I mean, if people were able to club together in communities to build their local wind farm so that they could...
We were expecting this, weren't we? This was the vision of the future was that we'd have very sort of locally created power, then distributed locally, and we'd be responsible for it. Hasn't really sort of happened.
No, and I think that tells you a lot about the power of the lobbies and the incumbents, and not very much about what innovation could do for us and what we're going to leave successive generations to deal with either.
We're running out of time now, but I think that's quite a tangible example of how politicians should be leading. Politicians should have ideas. They should be exciting us and getting us to do things. So, I mean, hopefully, if we can keep sort of boistering up democracy and get lots of new people to come and want to take an active part in democracy, whether it's being a local councillor, an MP, the people with these sort of ideas, I think things could really change.
It's a solvable problem. Yeah. And the people want it solved. And if we fail to solve it, it was because we failed to lead.
So let's end on an optimistic note that we have the capability to do this, and with democracy, we have the foundation to do it. Yeah. We just got to get on and get involved and do it, haven't we, really? Thanks very much, Tom.
My pleasure.
Great discussion. And I hope the rest of this week goes well for you.
Me too.